general anesthesia, one of the greatest medical mysteries. We don't know how it works. The two chemists, Hans Meyer and Ernest Overton, made a major breakthrough. The lipid hypothesis was right. By just moving this one group up, and has by this small change suddenly lost all of its anesthetic properties. This made literally no sense. Many new theories proposed. There were now 4 main weaknesses. They were actually just ignored. In fact, none of these theories could explain all the 4 inconsistencies of the original. While the reign of the lipid hypothesis had certainly been dominant, it was about to come to an abrupt end in 1984, marking one of the biggest revolutions in how we today think of general anesthesia. While proteins have long been thought to play a crucial role in the brain and control certain aspects of general anesthesia, most have been thinking and formulating theories from the perspective of lipids, but that was about to change. In a 1984 paper, researchers laid out how the Meyer-Overton correlation could be replicated with soluble proteins. While some have been suggesting that proteins could be the direct target of anesthetics earlier in history, this paper was a big stepping stone in making that belief widespread. This would also cause the unstable foundation of which the lipid hypotheses were built on to crumble, with the otherwise neglected inconsistencies finally surfacing. Still, a good amount of people would stay with lipids, but throughout the remaining 80s, the new and exciting area was that of direct interaction with proteins. With scientists' interest peaked, the big question was now which brain receptors were the most likely candidates for anesthetics to bind to, and would any direct link be identified? The answer to this would come from an unexpected place, or rather time, as the evidence was actually there in the early 1960s. The groundwork for this was laid in 1950, with the discovery of a small compound that would later turn out to be a major component of brain signaling. This was GABA-aminobutyric acid, better known as GABA. 7 years later, in 1957, the GABA receptor would be discovered, what we today recognize as the brain's primary receptor link. In the early 60s, many researchers would release papers suggesting that proteins may be the direct target of anesthetics. Specifically, we found that some anesthetics were potent activators of the GABA receptor. This included alpha-chlorelose, the anesthetic that was inconsistent with the lipid hypothesis. Oh, and remember its stereoisomer, beta-chlorelose, that mysteriously had no anesthetic action. Well, it turned out to somehow have no activity at the GABA receptor. This was a big deal. Protein receptors, unlike lipid membranes, were known to interact highly selectively with molecules, like in the case of ibuprofen. But now there was evidence for this with general anesthetics. In hindsight, proteins were a pretty obvious target, so it was probably just a matter of time before it was realized. Still, we couldn't really explain the details, but it seems suddenly we might have found out why some stereoisomers are not anesthetics. Maybe we'd even found the central mechanism of anesthesia itself. Many people still believing in a unitary lipid hypothesis did not agree with this. Despite the setback the inconsistencies had caused, they would work hard at updating now outdated Meyer-Overton version, with many of the theories I showed you earlier being puzzle pieces that had eventually helped to solve some of the issues with the original hypothesis, culminating in the lateral membrane pressure hypothesis, synonymously known today as the modern lipid hypothesis. First described in a paper from 1997, it explained that general anesthetics could act by disrupting internal membrane pressures in the lateral direction. When anesthetics build up in the membrane, the shift in pressure could cause surrounding receptors to malfunction, either becoming more or less active than needed for normal brain functioning, and voila, you lose consciousness. At least in theory, as they hadn't actually observed this phenomenon in a real brain. Even so, many on the lipid side celebrated this as a big milestone, seeing it as the first, more or less complete theory of anesthesia, due to the details to which it described a possible mechanism. Emphasis on possible, not proven. In the meantime, on the protein side, the evidence had strengthened significantly, with it being shown more definitively that direct bonding to the GABA receptor was indeed occurring. But in the process, they had also encountered a problem that once again would shake up the field, because it turned out there were many more. Not only had we discovered that direct bonding to protein receptors was in fact happening, but by the mid-2000s we had uncovered an overwhelming amount of protein receptors with which anesthetics interact. Some were not relevant to anesthesia, but a lot of them seemed to be, which created a new complication. For if the protein hypothesis turned out to be right, the sheer number of receptors and anesthetics involved now meant that what happens in the brain during anesthesia was likely exceedingly complex. To add to that, it was also becoming clear that different anesthetics were not all activating the same receptors. If right, this also meant that a foundational pillar of the field, Bernard's vision of finding a unitary mechanism of general anesthesia, would likely be dead. Scientists believing in either hypothesis have continued to clash, but throughout the remaining 2000s and 2010s, we've seen a mountain of evidence pile up on the protein side, while experimental support for the indirect path of the modern lipid hypothesis has been lackluster to say the least. With that being said, let's bring you up to speed on how we currently think of general anesthesia scientifically, more or less. Most believe that the mechanisms, plural this time, of general anesthesia are predominantly governed by direct protein bonding. Regardless of the mechanisms, there's an overwhelming number of protein receptors that anesthetics can affect, with a subgroup of these being relevant to anesthesia. The effects take place all over the central nervous system, that being the brain and spinal cord. No matter the receptor, the end goal will always be to affect ion channels. These are openings in a cell membrane that allow transport of various ions, like sodium, potassium chloride, and calcium, across it. Kinda like binary, you can say there are two states, with more ions either being located within or outside of the membrane. When transported across, it will affect the cell's ability to signal to other cells, either increasing or decreasing the number of signals being sent. Not too far from what the dendritic theory described over a century ago. As an example, the GABA receptor is inhibitory, so when activated, it will generally result in less signaling. Scaled up, this is essentially what shuts down your brain and body under anesthesia. Not entirely though, as processes like automatic breathing, your heartbeat and blood pressure, they are functioning perfectly fine. We don't really know why nature has built brains that are receptive to anesthetics in this oddly specific way, but we're very lucky that it has. It seems it could just as well as shut down everything or have had no effect, but here we are. We know that anesthesia not only affects areas of the central nervous system individually, but that it also disrupts the connectivity between them. The result is these 5 effects on the body. Interestingly, we found that they take effect kinda systematically. As the dose is increased, amnesia comes first, then sedation, followed by unconsciousness, and finally immobility and loss of reflexes. Take it with a grain of salt though, as it's not a hard fact. When talking about general anesthetics, we often use a 3-group classification based mainly on which receptors are involved. You'll recognize nitrous oxide in group 2 and ether in group 3. Group 1 and 3 anesthetics are both major activators of GABA-A receptors, while group 2 act heavily on one called NMDA. Group 1 are exclusively intravenous anesthetics, and they're great at inducing unconsciousness, which is why they're often used in the induction phase of anesthesia. Group 2 are better at providing pain relief, and are therefore often used in the maintenance phase, where the desired depth of anesthesia has already been achieved. Group 3 stands out for activating a much wider spectrum of receptors than the others, and I mean a lot. While group 2 are interesting because they do not suppress the type of signals we usually use to monitor brain activity, which makes it more difficult to evaluate how deep of an anesthetic state the patient is in. One of the advances that has come from all the research and classifications is that instead of just using one anesthetic like we mostly used to, We can now mix and match compounds from the different groups to achieve anesthesia with much lower doses than before, decreasing both the risks of going under as well as the side effects one can experience afterwards. As you can hear, we've identified lots of receptors relevant to anesthesia, made classifications of drugs, and even used that knowledge to improve surgeries. So doesn't that mean that we've kind of solved the mystery already? Well, superficially it might seem so, but things begin to become unclear if we dig a little deeper. Keeping with receptors for the moment, determining how important each of them is compared to another has been a big challenge. There are some cases where we're quite comfortable in the answer, but many more where we're not. We can also not be sure that all relevant receptors and compounds in the brain have been identified. And even though we now see direct bonding to protein receptors as a primary mechanism, any indirect activation by lipids or something else can certainly not be ruled out. I'll return to that one a little later. Then there's our limited understanding of how exactly anesthetics interact with receptors, the side effects they can have on the human body, genetic risk factors, and so on. But no limitation can compare to the case of consciousness, a phenomenon that has been notoriously difficult for us humans to understand scientifically. And as of now, we're simply not capable of explaining what causes consciousness to arise, or for that matter, what exactly it even is. It's a common belief among researchers that the mechanisms of general anesthesia and consciousness are intertwined, and to solve the mystery of one, we'll have to solve the other. It's all good that we can point to some receptors in the brain and say, well, these are the triggers, but it's a superficial explanation. To truly understand general anesthesia, we will have to fundamentally understand consciousness, and on that front, not much progress has been made. Occasionally, something new is discovered, like in 2014, when researchers were sending electrical impulses to a small part of the brain known as a claustrum, while having the patient read a book. They were trying to localize the cause of epilepsy, but instead, it made her stop reading and responding to anything.
We drove the country road out to her place.
Instead, she just sat there, staring blankly into space. When the electrical impulses were turned off, she would return to consciousness and reading her book, not knowing that it had even happened. At the time of this discovery, the claustrum was deemed the on-off switch of consciousness. But as it often happens, further research has shown that it's just not that simple. Another complication is that the majority of anesthesia research is being conducted in lab animals. And from the perspective of consciousness, there are obviously significant differences between, say, a human and a mouse or rat. We have still learned a lot from them, but animal models themselves cannot take us all the way. And even though strides have been made in a number of methods to scan and analyze the human brain specifically, we still have a long way to go. But regardless of these shortcomings, it's important we do not forget how far we've come. Less than 2 centuries ago, there was no effective anesthesia, and only simple surgeries were possible. Moreover, they were counted in minutes. In the early 20th century, we were up to hours, which culminated in a record-setting 47-hour surgery in 1978, and then the current world record of 103 hours, more than 4 days straight, in 2001. A separation of craniopagus conjoined twins, meaning that the twins' brains were intertwined, requiring not only that the common brain matter somehow be split between them, but then that hundreds of tiny blood vessels be meticulously separated and divided between the twins. The surgery required a total of 20 doctors taking shifts to cover the insane time span of the procedure, and they succeeded. If 19th century surgeons could see what we're capable of today, they would not believe their eyes. The practical application of general anesthesia has certainly not disappointed. As for mechanisms, however, the future is unclear. Almost 40 years have passed since the shift in our thinking to proteins occurred, and we're closing in on 2 centuries of studying general anesthesia since its recognition. Don't get me wrong, we've learned a lot, and it would certainly be inaccurate to simply state that we don't understand general anesthesia. Many of the puzzle pieces that will eventually make up a full picture of how anesthesia works, they have been found. It's just that the remaining pieces are exceedingly complex and difficult to tease out. And who knows, the script could possibly flip again, with lipids turning out to be more important than we think right now, or for an entirely new mechanism to emerge. The next steps will probably be to learn more about the involvement of the various protein receptors, more definitively which anesthetics affect what, how that occurs, and their relative importance, while the more difficult task of understanding consciousness will probably keep eluding us for the foreseeable future.
We know that anesthesia doesn't just put someone to sleep, it's closer to a temporary coma where you don't respond to pain or other stimuli. Your anesthesiologist can keep you in that state and reverse it when it's time to wake up. But what's actually happening in your brain while that goes on has been a mystery. Until now.
On the 20th of September 2020, the popular news channel SciShow uploaded a video titled "We Finally Know How Anesthesia Works," supposedly proclaiming that the mystery of general anesthesia had been solved. There's also no shortage of articles around the web with titles that will tell you the same. So what's going on here? Have I been lying to you all this time? To answer that, let's have a closer look at both cases. Take this news article from April 2020 with a title that certainly implies that the mystery is solved. But when you begin reading, this is quickly reduced to just one anesthetic, isoflurane only. They reference a single paper in which the researchers concluded that isoflurane is causing anesthesia by inhibiting calcium channels in two ways. But isoflurane is a group 3 anesthetic, the type that is known for affecting many receptors, so it's highly likely that multiple are involved, like GABA-A, which is referenced nowhere in the paper. They do mention potassium and sodium channels, but the focus is limited. Also, they do not use any of the modern techniques we have for ensuring that the effects are causal and not just correlations. And because the experiments were done in mice and rats, there's always the question of how transferable the results are to humans. I think the researchers went a little too far themselves with their conclusions in this one, as they seem pretty sure this is causing general anesthesia in humans, or at least is very important. You'll see why that might not be the case from this next study, released 2 months later in June, that also used isoflurane. And let me tell you, there were a lot of news media covering this study, although maybe for good reason this time. It also happens to be the study that SciShow referenced in their video. It detailed how researchers had found that a loss in consciousness could be directly linked to disturbances in something called lipid rafts in the brain. For simplicity's sake, you can imagine the lipid rafts as being small areas of a cell membrane where lots of receptors are concentrated, kind of a signaling center for the cell. In that video, SciShow explained that
The researchers used a super high-tech microscope to show lipid rafts expanding and bursting apart like billiard balls in response to anesthetics. When the rafts burst apart, they spill their contents, including an enzyme called PLD2. Once on the loose, the researchers showed, PLD2 heads over to a protein called TREC1. Once there, it binds to TREC1 and switches it on. That causes it to open up and churn out positively charged potassium.
this is pretty spot on. Isoflurane makes lipid rafts release PLD2 that activates TREC1, causing general anesthesia. TREC1 is one of the usual receptors that anesthetics are known to affect, but the part about lipid rafts being a mechanism by which that happens, that is new. What is less clear is SciShow's messaging throughout the video. The title clearly states that we now know how it works, which is repeated in the first statement.
But what's actually happening in your brain while that goes on has been a mystery. Until now.
Then they go to.
But a June 2020 study has revealed a major clue into the mechanism of general anesthesia.
Followed by.
How they were finally able to propose an answer to such an old question.
And in conclusion.
So we finally have an idea for how some kinds of general anesthesia work, after over 100 years of trying to figure it out.
Quite inconsistent, and I would argue also not accurate. As we've already learned, direct protein bonding has been seen as a primary mechanism of how anesthetics interact with your brain for almost 40 years, and there's good evidence behind that. Lipid rafts, it seems, can at most be a secondary mechanism. And the authors are also quite clear about this, stating that even when eliminating PLD2, The animal still lost consciousness with twice a dose of anesthesia, so other pathways are clearly involved. Oh, and about those animals.
In other words, you're out like a light, or so it went in fruit flies.
Yeah, they'd been studying fruit flies, which should have probably been mentioned a little earlier than 2/3 into your video SciShow. You can still get a lot of useful information from studying lower life forms, especially fruit flies actually, but we need to see some results in higher ones, ideally humans at some point, to show anything conclusive to us. Especially with something like lipid rafts, that's an ongoing research area in regards to determining all their functions in humans. By the way, I know I'm going in a little hard on SciShow specifically, instead of some of the news articles that also got things wrong. But it's because I have respect for them and I expect better. They have been a consistent source of reliable science news for the past, 11 years on YouTube. And I still remember watching them all the way back in high school. They're good people and I'm quite certain they didn't set out to produce a misleading video. This one though was just a clear miss from SciShow, at least in my opinion. Despite this, I really do think the paper is worth highlighting. SciShow didn't mention it, but the researchers also went on to use mutated fruit flies without PLD2 and showed that these were more resistant to anesthesia. This is known as reverse pharmacology, and it's really important as it shows with higher certainty that the lipid raft mechanism is in fact contributing to the anesthetic effects, not anesthetics interacting directly with the receptor or something else that's happening at the same time, what the other study did not do. As far as I know, this is the first more or less definitive proof of a membrane-mediated mechanism of general anesthesia, like the ones described by the lipid hypothesis after more than a century of searching, which I think is quite exciting. So in conclusion, while there's some pretty interesting research out there, it clearly does not support the headlines saying that the mystery of general anesthesia has been solved. Misleading headlines are of course a more general problem that you'll meet with almost any topic on the internet, so be sure you're aware of it so you don't end up getting fooled. The year is 1990 and Rachel Benmayer is about to give birth. In light of some complications, the doctors decide that a C-section is the best option. At first everything went as planned as she drifted away from consciousness with the administration of the general anesthetics, but suddenly everything was pitch black, which might seem completely normal, which it is, but the thing was, she felt awake, but she couldn't open her eyes or move, and at the same time, she was feeling this excruciating pain from her abdomen. The surgeons would go on to complete the C-section with her in this state, leaving her able to feel pain, but crucially without the ability to react. Stories like Rachel's have shown up now and then in the media. They're inherently scary and potentially anxiety-provoking for anybody who may need general anesthesia. So let's figure out what's been going on. What Rachel experienced is known as anesthesia awareness, a phenomenon where the patient gains back some of their consciousness during an operation and can recall this afterwards. There are multiple types, with the ones she experienced being paralyzed with little to no pain relief, by far being the worst. It's hard to describe the trauma people who have gone through this have faced. They often end up with mental scars that will follow them far into the future, just like the people who went through surgery before the invention of general anesthesia. Luckily though, this situation is exceedingly rare, as the average anesthesia awareness experience is a lot more tame. For most, awareness is no longer than 5 minutes, and the majority just remember hearing some noises, talking or movements. Also 2/3 occur either before the surgery has begun or after it has concluded. About 1 in 5 do report feeling pain, but it's more so something like a sore throat from the breathing tube that was inserted, or some slight stinging from the area of incision, not something serious. But that doesn't change that it can be an unnerving experience. Carol Reviver is probably the best known case of this, having an anesthesia awareness incident in 1998. While she did not feel any pain, the experience was so traumatic that it left her with PTSD and an inability to sleep properly. Rachel's and Carol's experiences are certainly worrying, but they're absolutely also the exception rather than the rule in terms of the long-term consequences one can expect from an encounter with awareness. Perhaps more importantly, they are also an example of what can happen when we fail to listen to patients and are too slow at implementing changes in the medical sector. Anesthesia awareness has undoubtedly been happening since the invention of anesthesia. But it has only really been in the 21st century that we've taken it seriously. And the mistakes don't stop there. Much of the initial research trying to assess how often it occurred was not well enough designed, relying on questionnaires that greatly underestimated the occurrence. These studies would typically conclude that only about 1 in 20,000 experience awareness. Today we know it's much closer to 1 or 2 in 1,000. Although you should know that the average is being dragged up by procedures such as C-sections, trauma and emergency operations, as well as high-risk patients, because we can only use light anesthesia in these cases for their safety. Regardless, it's occurring, and a lot more often than people were told in the past. And it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Remember I said Rachel felt she couldn't move? Well, this was no accident. It's due to the muscle relaxants the anesthesiologist gave her, specifically to paralyze her. These are a leading cause of awareness, but they're also essential in many surgeries to relax the body, so they're here to stay. Besides this, it's mainly equipment malfunctions and human error that's to blame for awareness in normal surgeries. And you'd be mistaken if you think it's easy to completely eliminate either of these. We may have highly trained staff, automated equipment and lots of protocols, but yet thousands of foreign objects are left inside patients every single year, simply because the surgeons forgot to remove them. Even something as seemingly preventable as this cannot in fact be prevented. Human errors are notoriously difficult to eliminate. Sure, if we had infinite resources, but in a sector as overworked and understaffed as hospitals, it's bound to occur sometimes. You may see articles claiming that the chance of this is 1 in 1,000, but that's quite misleading. Abdominal surgeries have by far the highest risk, going up to the claimed 1 in 1,000, but the average is significantly lower, probably in the neighborhood of 1 in 10,000. This could be a whole video in itself, so let's get back to awareness. Personally, I've only felt the effects of general anesthesia once when I was 7 years old and had my appendix removed. After the surgery, I told my mom that actually I never fell asleep, as I could hear the surgeons talking throughout the entire procedure. You may think this could be especially traumatic for a child, but you'd actually be wrong. Studies have found that most children don't really seem to care if they experience awareness, which was also my experience. But it's another story in adults. Data from the past suggests that around 50% of people will struggle in some way with this experience, but it likely doesn't have to be that way. My guess is that you probably didn't know much about anesthesia awareness, and in general, too few are told that they can wake up under surgery and what they'll feel like. Not knowing this can quite rightfully result in the patient getting scared, anxious or even panicking, especially if they're also experiencing paralysis. Educating the patient has been shown to greatly reduce the potentially negative consequences, as they are mostly mental. You may get paralyzed, but the odds of you waking up to feel significant pain under a surgery are extremely low. Once you know, it's not that big of a deal. And if you can feel that it is to you, tell the medical staff. Back when Rachel and Carol had their incidences, often nothing was done. Rachel just got an apology from the doctors, and Carol ended up suing the hospital. Finally, in 2004, the Joint Commission, a US-based organization that oversees hospitals and healthcare providers globally, issued a statement acknowledging anesthesia awareness as under-recognized and underreported, urging hospitals to educate their staff about the phenomenon. It took some time, but eventually the medical world has adapted. And while they cannot promise you to prevent awareness, it has become standard practice most places to guide an affected patient through this, both before a surgery and after an encounter with awareness. With articles about anesthesia awareness and the mechanisms of general anesthesia taking up a large part of the media's attention, it has inevitably left other areas without the coverage they deserve. In a paper from 1986, researchers first suggested that children exposed to general anesthesia could experience long-term developmental defects, like learning disabilities. The good news is that later studies have confirmed that a single exposure only increased the risk slightly, if any. But if a child has multiple, they jump significantly. Luckily, it does not seem to be a worry with cesarean births, where no relation has been found. And once you reach adulthood and have a fully developed brain, the risks also mostly fade away. What might not is a risk of boosting cancer. This is a more recent discovery, when multiple studies have found that cancer metastasis, the process of cancer spreading to other places in the body, could be increased after the removal of a tumor surgically. There may also be a general link to cancer growth after any exposure to general anesthesia. It's a developing field where we're still lacking a lot of answers, like how much the surgery itself versus the general anesthetics are to blame. The news is not all bad though, as regional anesthetics have been shown to have a protective effect, which could be used to counteract the negatives. Hopefully we'll know more in the near future, as we continue to learn more about how general anesthesia works. Oh, and before I end this chapter, I feel I should acknowledge that it has been a lot more heavy in opinions than the rest. And as with any other topic, there'll be people out there with differing opinions, which you should be sure to seek out before forming solid opinions of your own. I'm sure Rachel and Carol would put a more negative emphasis on anesthesia awareness than I did. There are also numerous ways to tell the story of general anesthesia, from its discovery through to now. And others may put emphasis on other points than I have. You didn't hear the name Crawford Long at all, a surgeon that used ether anesthesia successfully on patients years before Morton's famous demonstrations. While he was not the one to make the world aware of ether anesthesia, he does deserve credit for its discovery, at least in the West, as apparently in Japan they were doing hour-long operations with ether as early as the start of the 1800s. Although it's uncertain what level of anesthesia they really achieved, based on the documentation I have been able to find. All this is to say is that there's plenty more to cover than I have in this two-part series, and I've left some links below if you're interested in learning more yourself. Based on what I have laid out in this video, there's a risk you may feel more uneasy about surgeries, or in the worst case, get the idea that because of the unknown mechanisms, anesthesia awareness and other risks, general anesthesia is dangerous and one should fear surgeries. But I really don't want that to be the case. And not just because increasing your anxiety would not help, but because it's not true. While it can be scary to hear that we don't fully understand general anesthesia at a fundamental level yet, that is not equivalent to being unsafe. For starters, they're not the only common drugs we do not understand the mechanism of, with the pain and fever reducing drug paracetamol being quite poorly understood mechanistically. And while we do understand the mechanisms of other common drugs like ibuprofen, we typically have a limited understanding of their side effects, especially the rare ones. But as humans, we haven't gotten to where we are today by not using technologies just because we don't fully understand them. It might surprise you to hear that even the internal combustion engine in your car is not fully understood, with fuel combustion aspects such as turbulent flow, fuel chemistry, and much more still being active areas of research. And I imagine you have no problem driving a car, even though you don't know how every motor and electronic component works, and you can become incredibly good at it without knowing. In the same way, we can become experts in using anesthesia without knowing everything about it, and we have. Not primarily by studying mechanisms, but instead by focusing on becoming better surgeons, anesthesiologists, as well as anesthesia monitoring research. The number of these articles grew close to exponentially from the mid-1970s to the late 2010s, while studies focusing on mechanisms were stagnant if not declining. The focus has first and foremost been on safety, and it shows. Mortality solely attributed to anesthesia was about 350 per million before the 1970s, but then fell to around 50 in the 1970s to 80s and dropped even further to about 34 through the 90s, a more than tenfold reduction, and the same trends are seen with mortality overall in surgeries, and that's even though patient risk factors have increased during this time. Even so, it's important to acknowledge that we're obviously not done learning when it comes to mechanisms, cancer, brain toxicity, awareness, and more. Additionally, it does rarely occur that somebody relatively healthy goes under and never wakes up again. There are also other rare but fatal incidences that keep showing up, which are critical to solve no matter the rarity. But it's a value proposition. Some take on the risks of extreme sports or smoking for pleasure, but general anesthesia is for saving your life, or at least improving the quality of it. And it's damn safe for anybody not in a high-risk group. Even so, I know it can be scary, because you're giving up control, and us humans really don't like to do that. But like with flying, when it comes down to it, you don't have much to worry about. Perhaps studies into mechanisms will one day shed light on some of the remaining issues and make general anesthesia even safer. One thing I know for sure though, is that both anesthesia and consciousness are exciting fields of research that are gonna see many developments in the future. And who knows, maybe one of you watching is gonna be the one that finally solves a mystery that has been plaguing us for the last 177 years and counting. The mystery of general anesthesia.